Thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to talk with you all this afternoon, and I'm going to, excuse me, I'm going to talk first, and then I'll turn it over to Jan for a little bit, and then I'll close with some final data that we've collected, partly under the auspices of NAIA. Dog ownership in America, kind of a broad topic? I think so. So we're going to have to focus in on some specific areas. I want to start with some general information that's been published on the current status and trends in dog ownership in the U.S. We're going to look at data on purebred dogs, very limited data on purebred dogs. This is what we're just now getting into. We're going to talk about shelter dogs. In terms of sources for dogs, we're basically going to focus on those two sources, purebred from breeders, but from other sources as well, and also shelter dogs. We'll close with some challenges. This list could go on. You could generate your own elements here, and if we, hopefully, we have some questions for future investigation and a question and answer period. So I want to start setting the stage with some data from the American Pet Products Association, which does a pet ownership survey every 2 years. The only version I can afford was the one 2 years ago, so there is a new one out. And many of you are familiar with these data. But looking at the percent of U.S. households that own dogs and cats and other animals, and they deal with a lot of different animals, about 39% of U.S. households have dogs, and about 34% of households have cats. What's interesting about these graphs, dogs are at the top if you can't read the key, households, is how steady this has been for a decade or so. I think this represents a saturation point. There's a certain proportion of households in the U.S. that want, have, and will be getting dogs in the future. Households increase, the number of households increases each year as the population does. So there are new households becoming available, but this is not an infinite place. And dog ownership basically is a function of households where they can live. I threw in fish and birds. This is all I'm going to say about them, just to show you, this is fish and birds, to show you what a very distant third and fourth place they are in the American heart for companion animals. When we look at numbers, back around 1988-89, the number of cats in households, the number of pet cats surpassed the number of pet dogs in this country. Again, that's probably nothing new, but you can see here it continues to climb. This time the upper line is cats, almost 94 million cats. In 2008, that's the last year I have data on, or that APPA has published data on, and then 77.5 million dogs. Purebred versus mixed breed dogs in the U.S. households for substantial number of years. You can see the proportion of purebred versus mixed breed dogs and how these data were collected. It's important to know how data were collected. In the APPA survey, they would ask respondents to give information on up to 3 dogs. Some only had 1 dog in the household, some may have had 12. So there is some bias, and we're not sure which direction it is, but this is certainly not saying this is the proportion of all dogs in the U.S. are proportioned this way in households. APPA breaks their data down in a lot of interesting and insightful ways, one of which is on household income, and you can see at the far left. Well, anyway, less than $12,500 a year up to over $60,000 a year. What might not be obvious just looking at this briefly is look at the two extremes and how there is a shift in lower income households, or at least the lowest income household, more mixed bred dogs, whereas in the upper income households, the higher income households, more purebred dogs. That's not startling revelation. We know that cost of some purebred dogs is a factor in the choice people make. Let's look generally at sources of dogs, starting with some data that we were involved in gathering back in 95 and 96. These are various categories where a dog might have come from. These are not dogs entering a household. This is the percent of dogs in households by source. 21% from breeders, friends, strangers, ads in newspapers. What's happened in the last 6-7 years is internet has now, as a source, has been added to the APPA market studies. Offspring of animals that they owned, shelters, strays, gifts, pet shops, and veterinarians. And there's been some other interesting new sources that have been identified. So, purebred dogs, we know that's coming from breeders. Well, my assumption was that pet store dogs were purebred, so it's not just 21%. Shelters do have purebred dogs being adopted from them. It's a very tricky thing to say, as any of you who may have worked with shelters, anything that looks like a beagle or a golden is going to be called a beagle or a golden. It may not be what we would think of as purebred. So the point of this is that in these other sources are going to be hidden at some unknown level, probably purebreds. So looking at the APPA data, in addition to ours up through 2008, this is the trend of source of dogs from breeders. And again, this is source of dogs living in the household at the time of the survey. Friends and relatives. It's for many years been a common source, probably not representing any exchange of money, but that network of people who already own dogs who are giving them to family members and friends. The stranger, the newspaper ad, the internet, fairly stable over several years. Pet stores, and in the last 3 surveys, APPA broke out pet superstores, dogs purchased from pet superstores. They also have a category adopted from superstores. So my assumption is if they buy it from a pet superstore, it's a purebred. If they adopt it from a superstore, it's a mixed breed. And you know there's flaws in that. And then finally, shelters. If you can't see these colors very well, this is the shelter line that goes down a little bit, but over the last few years, and this is true into 2010, I don't have the data for it, is increasing in terms of animals coming from shelters. This is just a table to show you some additions that APPA added: rescue groups, adopted from pet stores, and then pet store / superstore. I combined their data here. So the point of this is when you see source data, don't take it on face value. You have to look into it a little more deeply and use your own lens of experience to know what kind of dogs are they talking about. 2 statements from this last, or the report I had. A dog obtained from a breeder remains relatively unchanged, average about 27%, and that has not really changed in a decade. Although these other sources of purebred dogs are not necessarily captured in that statement. Dogs obtained from an animal shelter have increased from 10 to 19% between the 2 years of this particular study, as did dogs from friends and relatives from 27 to 33%. So, sources and trends of purebred dogs. Before we get into this discussion, I think it would be good to talk about what we mean by purebred. You've heard a variety of definitions this morning. If you're giving your dog a nose check, they might say Dachshund, Beagle, Poodle, and what? Yorkie, Boston Terrier. As a college professor, there will be an exam at the end of this talk, so think about these questions. How many of you don't have to answer now, how many of you would call this a purebred? A purebred? I mean the one in the upper left. Purebred? I'm going back to the icons of my youth here, except for Eddie. Purebred? The point of this is who defines what a purebred is. Obviously, registries define it. You define it in the breeds that you love and care for and raise. Media also defines purebred, not necessarily by the same standards, but ultimately the consumer is going to say, cockapoo is a purebred. We cannot argue with that mindset. We might try to educate, but that's the reality. The consumer, meaning the person who's going to buy or obtain a dog, if they are enamored with the idea of a cockapoo, whatever that idea is, that's a purebred to them. Yep. So thanks to Patty Strand and Angie Niles and others at NAIA, they gave me some data in the form of this graph of AKC registrations, at least historically back to 1931. And this is probably no surprise to anybody, but you can see the very steady climb in purebred registrations, especially after World War II. A little peak here, a decline, maybe a plateau in here, then another spike. And then an alarming, to many people, decline since about 1992 to the point that in 2008, this level of registrations was equal to the level in 1965. So, a closer look at the more popular breeds registered with AKC. That was our first step in looking at some of these data. And our definition of popular breed is it had to be in the top 10 at least once in the last 12 years. Labrador Retriever, but there is a decline. Again, this is probably not news to many in the room. Golden Retriever, decline in registrations. German Shepherd, maybe some decline, but also a tendency to plateau. Dachshunds, that's the breed I am most familiar with, a decline. The Beagle, the Rottie, the Chihuahua, the Shih Tzu, the Boxer, maybe leveling off. Miniature Schnauzer, losing ground. The Yorkie. The Yorkie is the only one of these breeds that has more or less maintained its registrations with AKC. Now, that in itself implies their bias. AKC is not the only registry. And there's other reasons that we're going to touch on, but we don't have answers to this. That's what we're kind of talking about. Bulldog is the only breed of the 12 we looked at, most popular ones, that had increased in registrations, whatever that means. So, what are some factors that could account for this overall decline? This is speculation. You can add your own ideas here too. Perhaps there are fewer breeders registering purebred dogs with AKC. Not necessarily fewer registrations, but fewer breeders feeding registrations in. Some who used AKC formally and exclusively maybe have started using other registries. We looked at, of the 31 registries that we had a list of that took purebred dog registrations in North America. We tried to find out information on the registries, starting with something as simple as the year founded. And 7 or 8 of them, we couldn't even find that. And we could not access their numbers to try to get some insight into the question, are registrations declining in other registries? AKC certainly is the biggest. So when you graph, we'll go back to this in a minute, you can see prior to 1930 there were 3 registries. Someone else earlier this morning mentioned those 3. In the 1930s, a new registration was formed. In the 60s, 3 new, 1 in the 70s, 2 in the 80s, 5 in the 1990s, and 3 in 2000 to 2010. When you show these new registrations superimposed on the first graph, you can see 3 registries a few years before this plateau or decline, whichever you choose to call it. A couple of more here, then at this peak, soon afterwards, 5 and now 8 registries since the peak. I'm not saying that these are the reasons for the decline. It may be part of it, but we don't know how much that is contributing to what we're seeing on this graph. Some other possible reasons, perhaps fewer litters are being registered with AKC. Breeders are still producing the same number of puppies, but they may not be registering all puppies they produce. I don't know. Maybe dividing their registrations between 2 or more registries. Fewer litters are being registered with any registry. You can get papers to register a puppy, as you all know. That doesn't mean those are going to eventually end up in a registry. Puppies may still be produced, but not being registered anywhere. Multiple pressures are on breeders these days, as you're aware, and you'll hear a little bit more later this afternoon. Cost of maintaining a breeding, some breeders leave the industry, the hobby. The cost of maintaining a breeding kennel, if you're going to do it right, is not cheap. Regulations, laws, and local ordinances, there may be a decline in the market, meaning the people interested in a particular breed. Maybe loss of breeding stock. Some of the breeders I know personally, they have had, as they have aged and their breeding stock has aged, when those animals pass away, they leave the business. The general economic situation has impacted us all, or just lack of time and effort required to do it right. Maybe there are fewer breeders in the industry of selected breeds. We only looked at the top 12 most popular by the definition I gave. Maybe the decline, which that graph is all breeds, maybe certain breeds are contributing to that decline more than others. The market niche, defined as current and potential pet owners, or dog owners in particular, might be filled with dogs that are not purebred. Obviously, marketing efforts by shelters and national humane organizations for shelter dogs you're all aware of. Humane translocation, which I'm sorry I missed Patty's talk this morning. I'm not sure if you touched on humane location. There's going to be a little more discussion on it later in the conference. Shifts in the sources of acquisition, from breeders to shelters to friends, relatives, etc., that might favor mixed bred dogs versus purebred. Perhaps the market niche is being filled by other animals. Cats are popular. Small mammals are becoming more popular too. Fewer people are consciously adding, replacing dogs in their homes because of the general economic downturn. Again, perhaps, I have no data to suggest that's happening or what the magnitude of it is. Changes in housing. In my own family, I have seen family members move from single-family dwellings into apartments, and that certainly limits the kind of animal you can have. Changes in jobs or just loss of a job. Regulatory and ordinance pressures also may be influencing the consumer on their decision to get or to replace a dog or to get a dog in the first place. So we're going to talk now a little bit about trends in shelter dog populations, and I'm going to turn it over to Jan.
Thank you, John. I have to start off with a little bit of a story to add to this, to what you kind of a common theme about data and misuse of data and not really reporting the truth. A few years back, I go to a lot of humane organization meetings, and I was interested in one of the breaks. I went up to one of the vendors who supplies software to animal shelters. So this software is used to record the number of intakes, adoptions, etc., and help track animals within the shelters. And I had several questions. I was interested because I'm an epidemiologist who studies numbers. And I went in and I said to him, you know, I have several questions that I would like to ask of your database, and I wonder if you could help me. I mean, would you work with me to help me do that? And we started to talk about my questions, and it was one of these situations where he seemed really anxious to answer and address my concerns, but we weren't getting anywhere. And I kept trying to rephrase the questions, and he kept trying to answer my questions. And then he stopped, and he said to me, "Oh, I get it. You want to know the truth from the data." And I went, "Well, doesn't everybody?" And in fact, of course, a lot of the shelters come to him because they're looking for donor dollars. They're looking to please their boards. And they were looking for information that would help them do that. And so if that was consistent with the truth, fine. If it wasn't, they wanted the data spun in a way that would help them. So, you know, you could argue they need money, they need support, but it illustrated to me very quickly that, you know, in the real world, and I know this, of course, that people can misuse data, and they have very different motivations for using the data. So I thought before we started talking about some of the data from the shelters, and obviously I'm just going to give you a very, very minimal snapshot of that because of the time. But I thought I'd tell you a little bit, and I think many of you probably recognize this, just to put the numbers in context. The sheltering community has been changing radically over a relatively short time. And there's been a tremendous increase in the professionalization of shelter staff, and particularly of shelter management. And that means that the executive directors now are often coming out of business. They're looking at, yes, they're looking at homeless animals and trying to place them, but they're also a commodity. And they're also recognizing not only do they have to manage their shelter staff and everything more professionally, but they've caught on to the notion of market share, and that they are competing with other sources of animals in order to get these animals into homes. And so, of course, they're going to adopt measures that help them compete with other sources of animals. I have to say, historically, they didn't do that very well. Very often people would not go to the shelter because it was in the worst part of town. It was a dark, awful place. There were animals dying there. And how many of you have been to a modern shelter in the last, say, 5 years? Many, and if you haven't been, please go. I mean, because what you'll be struck by is that they're modern in many cases, or they've been renovated with bright lighting, better housing for their animals, and that's not only to improve the welfare of those animals, but it's also to make it a more desirable place for you to acquire an animal from a shelter. So there's been this emphasis on marketing, and as you know, there's the Pet Finder, the Pet Tangos on the internet, where people can actually look to see what animals are available in shelters across the country. And if you don't find something in your local shelter, you can find it someplace else. Certainly there's been a concerted effort to find alternatives to euthanasia. that rather than reach for the blue juice and deal with too many homeless animals for the homes that they have in fact resorted to finding very innovative solutions. So now you'll see where it used to be if you were a 10-year-old mixed breed black dog walking through the door, you probably would be euthanized. Today there are programs like Seniors for Seniors. So people who feel like they're aged enough that they might not live out the lifespan of a young dog can now adopt from a shelter a senior animal. Along with that, of course, we've seen the growth of the no-kill, or so-called no-kill shelters. They're called, the technically and politically correct term is adoption guarantee shelters, because they do, in fact, euthanize, and if they don't, they're probably not humane. Then there's been a real effort to have enhanced cooperation between shelters, and particularly with regards to translocation or transfer programs, so that shelters that have a shortage, particularly of puppies, usually, and want people still to come into the shelter. They want people to come there and think about them as a source of animals, because they may also, by the way, adopt a bunny or a cat while they're there. They will, if they have a shortage of puppies, make an arrangement with an area in the country that has an excess of puppies that are euthanizing those puppies and then transfer those animals. And well done, it's not a bad idea. Unfortunately, like many human endeavors, not all of them are well done. Certainly there's the enhanced societal expectations for the care of these animals. And so you're seeing shelters having to invest a lot more money to really provide good care for these animals, which is good because then they can attract more donor dollars as well to be able to meet those expectations. There's been the growth of shelter medicine, which has really been a really wonderful thing for the shelters. I won't talk about that today, although it's near and dear to my heart. And then, of course, the increased affluence of many shelters. Many shelters now, while they're always looking for resources, of course, in fact, are better and more well-heeled than even 20 years ago. Okay. So how many shelters are there? Well, guess what? It all depends on what you call a shelter, right? Is that a brick and mortar? And in fact, back in the mid-90s, John and I and our colleagues tried to count the number of shelters in the world, the brick and mortar shelters. I'll catch your question in just a minute. That turned out to be an extraordinarily difficult thing to do. And in fact, we were never successful in actually counting the number of shelters. We think there's somewhere between 3,000 and 4,000 brick and mortar shelters. We have no idea how many rescue groups there are. I don't know of anyone who knows that. We have, how many dogs enter shelters every year? Probably between 3 and 4 million. And again, probably because we don't have good data. And about half of those are being euthanized. So this is just to orient you, to get you to think about some of the metrics that the shelters are looking at in order to assess their progress over time. So they're looking at intake. Obviously, their goal is to reduce that intake. And at the other end, they're trying to, of course, increase the positive outcomes of the animals entering the animal shelters. And that would take the form of adoptions, transfers out of that shelter to another shelter that theoretically at least can adopt those animals, and then of course the return to owner, because many of these shelters have an animal control responsibility and do round up animals and bring them in as strays and then try to return them to their owners. So kind of just one other couple comments on this. What I'd like to do is concentrate for a moment on this live release rate. This is a metric that shelters are increasingly using, and what it is essentially all of those positive outcomes divided by all of the outcomes, all of the animals that have an outcome. So we have some shelters now that have live release rates into the 90s. Of course, we still have some that are still in the 30s. But the trend is toward an increasing live release rate. Now, the only thing I would say to you about a live release rate is you need to always look at the denominator. What did they put into the denominator? And we've had this problem with some shelters where they have a very good live release rate, but they have animals accumulating in their shelter. They're essentially a kind of glorified hoarding situation. so that the live release can be deceptive and hide other problems that might be going on in the shelter. The other thing I wanted to mention about this is this relationship to human community. If you're in a community where the human population is either rising very quickly or declining very quickly, but you're only looking at your intake rates, so if the human population is going up, as was mentioned earlier by John, we know that usually the dog population or the cat population also rises in those communities. And so if you just look at, so your intake may in fact go up, not because you're doing a poorer job or that your programs to try to diminish intake are going down, but simply that you have more people in the community and the same rate per 1,000 people is there, but it looks like, in fact, you are losing ground with your intake. So just a word of caution. So where do our data come from? Well, they come from a variety of different sources. Individual shelters, of course, states that have mandatory collection of data from shelters, of which I think last count I had was 5. There may be more than 5 now. Certain research projects, special collections. Patty already mentioned that NAIA has data on shelters. The Maddie's Fund has been collecting data from a group of shelters to report their intakes and outcomes. And then more on the scene, more recently, we've seen these software companies that, and PetPoint in particular, that is a subsidiary of, or a product of Pet Health, now is in about 1,700 shelters in the country. So if you believe that there are around 3,000, we may have as many as half of the shelters in the country contributing to this database. They're very guarded about their database. I suspicion they may be charging money to look at it. I have some data from them that I'm going to share with you. It's not absolutely comparable because their numbers of shelters are going up over time. So when you look at the data, you're looking at a moving picture, but I'll show you that in a few minutes. And then John's going to talk a little bit about SPI, and I'll let him tell you a little bit more about that. Again, just a quick reminder here that counts have their place. You can talk about, we had 40,000 animals enter our facility last year, and this year we had 35,000. So they mean, and that would indicate that 5,000 fewer animals came through the door. That said, if you're a shelter so let's say you have 50,000 animals entering, you want to know, well, we killed 12,000, but what proportion is that? How does that compare to another shelter that may have 30,000 entering? How are you doing in relation to those? Or over time in your own shelter, if your denominators are changing, how are you doing? So we have to look at both rates and absolute numbers. And again, we want to be careful looking at the denominators. What denominators are we using here? And I think it's important to try to correct for the human population, although recognize that if you're one shelter and there are 5 other shelters in your area, or umpteen different rescue groups, using the total population is simply not going to reflect, your facility may not reflect what's going on in the other facilities. So there's some limitations to doing that as well. So let's just look at some. These are published studies, and these I feel are very high quality studies, but they're done in very specific places. This is a study that comes out of Colorado for the years 2000 to 2007. And what's nice about this is that they have about 92% of the dog intake in their shelters captured in this database. And in this interval, dog intakes per 1,000 residents now, this is per 1,000 human residents, decreased by 10.8%. The adoption rate, interestingly enough, in Colorado per human population decreased by 14.8%. But the transfer out from those shelters increased by 57.5%. So what ends up happening is that their live release stays reasonably the same per 100,000 people. And their euthanasia rate also stays reasonably the same. They're just adopting out fewer and actually now sending other animals to other shelters where they'll be adopted out over that period of time. Ohio, now these are animal control agencies. So these are essentially the municipal, what used to be the municipal pound, the municipal animal shelters. And so they're taking in animals, they usually have less money to work with, they're taking in fewer species, principally dogs, because they're complying with whatever the state laws are that keep animals off the streets. But you can see that between 1996 and 2004, even in the animal control industry, we're seeing a decline in intake, an increase in adoptions, and a decline in euthanasia. This is a little bit hard to see because of the scale, but what I wanted to point out was that these are from about 1,200 shelters throughout the country. This comes out of Pet Point data. And what we're seeing here is an increase of 4% between 2007 and 2010. So that's a relatively short period of time, but an increase of 4% in adoptions from these shelters, a decrease of about 6% in euthanasias, and about a 3% increase in transfers. So certainly shelters have caught on that they can transfer. They're certainly trying to do a better job of getting their animals into the market. And yes, to some extent, they are competing with breeders. Now, I would say, and I think, John, in my experience, is that the proportion of purebreds is certainly no higher than 21, 24%. And fortunately or unfortunately, a lot of those purebreds aren't really purebreds. They've been made, that designation has been made by a person sitting at the front desk as they're accepting animals. So just some thoughts. There's certainly a lot of variability in the numbers and rates, and there's no one way to characterize the entire country of the United States or what's happening in all shelters. I will say this, I do think that intake is declining. I think that that's been supported not only by recent data, but by previous data. I think perhaps the one area of the country that's not necessarily happening with is the Southeast. We still have puppies being euthanized in the Southeast. And that, of course, has been fueled the interest in transfer programs to bring some of those puppies in particular up to the Northeast where there are shortages of puppies, or other parts of the country where there are shortages of puppies. I think overall, they are achieving a higher and higher live release rate. Again, tremendous variability among different sections of the country. I think in terms of absolute numbers, euthanasia rate and euthanasia rate per 1,000 people, I think that's coming down, no question about it. I mean, they've been successful. That's not to say, and I'm just speaking now from the humane community standpoint, they still see millions. It's true, it's not 18 million, and it's declined considerably, but they still see millions from their perspective, and that's what they're continuing to go after. And I'll catch your question in just a minute. And I think also that overall our adoption rates are going up in shelters, and I don't have a slide for it, but we have one, I think, pretty good study that was funded by PetSmart Charities about 2 years ago now, which looked at among people who had acquired a dog in the last 12 months, what proportion of them got their dogs from a shelter, and shelter being very broadly defined, probably including rescue groups and shelters. And that was about 24%. So that's up from any of the previous estimates, given their own challenges or limitations, but that's certainly up. And I personally believe that they have captured a higher market share of new animals entering homes. How does that break out in terms of puppies? How does that break out in terms of purebred? We don't know. We don't have any data on that. So I'm going to turn that now over to John and let him continue. Sorry, John.
No problem. I think the questions are an excellent demonstration of why having data doesn't mean you have answers. You have to know how the data were collected and how to interpret them and what's going to influence, bias, or confound those data. So I want to close before just a few slides on challenges with the Shelter Population Index, which started with the National Council on Pet Population Study and Policy several years ago. The AKC was a founding member of that council. And we were able to finish the dog analysis of the data thanks to the NAIA, so I'm very thankful for that. The concept is that could we create an index similar to the Dow Jones Industrial Index? Maybe not a good analogy these days. But in other words, a snapshot that's not going to tell you how your city or your state is doing, but on a national basis, maybe on a multi-state regional basis, could we get a snapshot of where we are and look at that over time? So the SPI is reflective of it is tied to the population. As Jan mentioned, that's one way to look at data. So that it is reflective in a general sense of how much resources a community is putting towards the excess animal issue. Just for the sake of time, I won't read the objectives, but one of the elements of the SPI, how you define your data, is very important. And any of you have looked at in detail on what a live release rate means, you can see some definitions that are variable maybe from one community, one shelter to the next. So we tried to choose things that a shelter that was going to participate with us would not have problems interpreting. So animals received, that's a number that can be counted. Number that are adopted, that can be counted. Returned to owners, transferred to other agencies. This transfer issue is very interesting to me, but right now, I don't think there's any usable data on transfers that can give us insight into issues that we need to be worried about. Euthanized, died or lost in the shelter. So the data we collected were simple. This is the formula, and again, I'll take time. I'll be here through tomorrow afternoon to discuss this further with anybody who would like to, but for the sake of time, we're looking at green, positive, what we consider positive outcomes, red, negative outcomes over all the outcomes, and these are weighted against the community that the shelter or coalition of shelters is serving. So the SPI in general terms can range from -1 to +1 with a balancing point around 0. So worst case scenario, everything that comes into the shelter is killed. You're going to end up with a -1 SPI. Best case scenario, everything that comes into the shelter, just to be really simplistic, everything that comes in is adopted. You're going to get a +1. Obviously, we're not very often, certainly not on a regional basis, going to end up with the two extremes. So we requested data from 2007 and 2008. We wanted to estimate the SPI for at least 2 years to see if we could detect any trends. And we had over 565 shelters participate. The reason I don't have an exact number is sometimes coalitions of shelters gave us their data and they did not tell us who the names or the number of shelters contributing to that. 42 states in the District of Columbia. We had information on about 2 million dogs, approximately 1 million dogs for each of the 2 years we're talking about. The estimation of the national SPI for dogs in 2007 was 0.69, 0.309 for 2008. It's positive, that's a good sign. It's also a little higher in 2008, but I'm not going to tell you that represents improvement. That could be just variation. And we've only been able to test this on 2 years. But we wanted to look a little further at how this might vary by census divisions. And this is the way the U.S. Census Bureau divides the country. There are 4 census regions, as you can see by the big bolded letters, and 9 census divisions represented by these subunits. So we broke the data out by census division. Our target at the beginning of the study was to try to capture data from shelters that covered at least half of the U.S. population, both nationally as well as in these regions. We were only partially successful in that. On a national basis, the shelters were serving about 53% of the U.S. population, but it did vary by division. You can see it here. The ones that stand out, Division 4, and I'll show you again the states that represents here in a little bit, not even a quarter of the population shelters covering that population, and less than 20% for Division 6. Close to 50, and you can see some like Division 9, almost 70%, so quite variable. So let's look at it on a regional basis. This is graphically illustrating those 2 points I mentioned as a national estimate. Positive with a slight increase in 08 versus 07. Okay, here's Division 1, and you can see in the map up here the states it represents, New England, doing a pretty good job with dogs. As we go through these, think also transfers. Where the transfers may start, where they may be going. The better job you do, the more you're going to have a niche for puppies. Division 2, again, you can see the states in the upper right, doing a pretty good job, and again, perhaps a suggestion that there's been improvement over just that 2-year span. Division 3, still positive. Division 4, but remember Division 4 was one of those divisions where we had poor participation. Division 5, my home state division, also one with very poor participation. But I know anecdotally, my state sends a lot of puppies out of state because there are places to adopt them there as opposed to having to euthanize them in state. And I suspect that's true of some of the other states in this division. Division 7. Got some real problems there. These are also states that are sources of translocated dogs. I don't know anyone that knows the magnitude, though, of those transfers. So back to end on a more cheerful note, the West, as it's called, and then the Pacific area of the country, doing at least a positive job in dogs that enter shelters. So, some challenges, the market, and I hate to refer to dogs as a commodity, but I think it's useful in our thinking that they're a product that some people want. The market for purebred dogs certainly has, or may be continuing to change. The market likely varies by breed of dog. To address the market, we need data from consumers, the people who are potential purchasers of purebred dogs. What is the decision process that potential dog owners go through to choose a particular dog? Some work we did several years ago, one of the interesting things we found, and it's a very small study, is that if they grew up with boxers, they're more likely to get a boxer. What are more kids going to likely grow up with in terms of purebreds today? You know, the more popular breeds. What influences potential dog owners in their decision process? You know, when we got down in a puppy study we did to, okay, you are looking at a litter of puppies, purebred, mixed breed, we didn't discriminate. What made you decide on this puppy out of that litter? What do you think the number one reason was? Cuteness? Color. Again, small study, but color. Okay, the marketing of purebred dogs is a challenge and an opportunity. Why do you love the breed that you do? What qualities would commend it to others? I mean, you can answer those questions. Does the consumer, in that broad umbrella term, know about these qualities? Or will they make less informed decisions? Not every breed fits in every household and lifestyle. Anybody disagree with that? I hope not. I'm saying you because I know there are many breeders represented here and breed interest groups. Breeders are often the most knowledgeable source of information on fitness of their breed in a particular family or household. The quality of the product, the dog that's produced, is critical. If there's a market for a cockapoodle Sioux, is there such a breed? I tried to make one up, and then it occurred to me on the plane, maybe there is one. There will be someone who will supply that market. No matter what the breed, quality of the breeding is separate from the fact that the dog is purebred. So, in closing, many, many people and organizations made the various studies that we've reported possible, including most recently, as I mentioned, the National Animal Interest Alliance. Contributors and supporters, not necessarily money, but you can see there. And I want to publicly thank the staff of shelters who pulled the data together and shared it with us, and a lot of individuals, some of whom you'll recognize as members of NAIA. So I don't have any idea what our time is. I know we're over. Jan and I will both be here through the rest of the conference, so unless, Patty, you want to suggest questions, we can save them till... Two questions? Throwing away the clock. Uh-oh. And Dennis is going to be the dinner speaker?
Yeah, he doesn't.
Okay, thank you very much.